The best conversations don't give you answers. They challenge how you think. I'm your host, Stephanie Chung, and as a keynote speaker and the author of Ally Leadership, I get a rare kind of access to the real conversations with the people worth listening to. And this show is me bringing that access to you. So pull up a chair and let's dive into our next conversation with someone not like me. Welcome back to the show. In today's conversation, I am joined by two powerful voices. I have with me Sarah McFarland, who is a board-certified behavior analyst with over 13 years of experience training teams on how to respond with skill, not emotion. Like, I could stop right there. That's huge, right? How do you respond with skill, not emotion? But Sarah also coaches competitive athletes, which means that she understands the connection between performance, pressure, and people. And we also have Dr. Alicia Hodge, a clinical psychologist who specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy and wellness innovation. So her work tends to focus on one core truth: what we think drives how we feel and how we behave. Alicia's work sits in the intersection of science and self-awareness. So with this stellar lineup, here is where we are going today. We're going to talk about and take a real look at what happens when not like you shows up as someone who's neurodiverse or someone who suffers with anxiety. We're going to break down what is actually happening in the brain in those moments, because if you do not understand that, it is very easy to misread behavior and respond in the wrong way. So let's get into it. So first of all, Dr. Alicia and Sarah, I'm so excited that you both are here. But the reason why we're doing this, and it's one of these things I want to share with the audience, something that happened that really got me thinking about how we need to talk a lot more about people who are perhaps neurodiverse or struggle with anxiety, all of those different types of things. We need to talk about that more because it's so relevant in the workplace, especially in today's environment. And so what had happened is I was speaking at a conference. And there was a gentleman that came up to me during the meet and greet and the book signing, and he said something very simple, but yet profound to me. And he said, "Steph, thank you for seeing us." He says, "I have autism, and I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned those of us that are neurodiverse in your speech." And so it was one of those things that, I had made just one comment about, just today's modern workforce and how there's so many differences. And I appreciated the fact of, him giving me the compliment, but it actually challenged me a bit as well to realize that he's right. We really don't talk a lot about this particular segment of the workforce. And yet it is part of today's modern workforce, right? We tend to think of maybe people who have ADD or autism as children. But children have grown up, they're in the workforce. And so how do we as colleagues and leaders, how do we be better at actually working with folks that may see the world differently than we do, or move about the world differently than we do, or perhaps have a different thought process than we do? And so I'm really excited about this particular segment. And I know I've got the two professionals on here that can help give us all some clarity and direction and help us to see what we're doing right, what we could do better, and how we can, at the end of the day, just be a better colleague for those that perhaps just, again, see things a little bit differently than we do. So with that said, I have questions for you two ladies. The first thing I want to know is this. Alicia, when you think about anxiety, because I know that you specialize, what does that actually mean? Like, just so we can kind of get a baseline, what does that actually mean when we talk about someone who is struggling with anxiety?
Yeah, and so I like to sort of make the point that we've all experienced anxiety in some form.
Mhm.
And that's just as simple as you remembering, like, oh my gosh, I have to send an email. That is your body just really quickly getting you into a mode of alertness and spurring you into action. However, at higher levels, when you're really struggling with anxiety, it looks more like oftentimes being paralyzed or avoidant. And so we see that show up in the workplace. With high functioning anxiety, which means you're probably doing these things and suffering in silence. So you may be slow to start on projects, difficulty concentrating, extreme dread, at the idea of maybe speaking with someone or sending an email, or just being really avoidant, like paralyzed and not unsure where you can get started.
I like that. I like that. So that's, it's, I want to continue on that, but I'm actually going to step back for a second because there's something that you actually specialize in that I think will, that will be very, very good for all the listeners to really zone in on, which is fear-based behaviors, i.e. perfectionism. And so, what I'd
Mhm.
love to hear you talk about, I'm going to step back to anxiety in just a second, but I don't want to miss the perfectionism.
Yeah.
So, tell me a little bit about that. What does that mean when we say that somebody's a perfectionist?
Yeah, absolutely. So perfectionism does fall under the umbrella of like an anxiety related type of disorder. So ultimately, what that means is that someone is really married to unrelenting high standards.
Mhm.
And while that has the pros of usually good output and great product, it tends to put you in this trap of being really fearful of not meeting that standard or constantly raising the standard so that things don't feel good enough. You may not feel good enough personally, but also the product of your work or others around you. You may have difficulty really accepting praise and kind of being stuck in a more critical space in which the first thing you notice after you do something is what you could have done better instead of being able to absorb just even a moment of reflection of like, wow, I really got that done.
I like that. So what can people do? Because I'm gonna say something that hopefully won't be controversial. It's one thing if you're a perfectionist, it's another thing to
Mhm.
work for a perfectionist, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean that
Mhm.
can be tough. It can be tough. I've had a boss like that where it can really be tough for the entire team. And so I guess my question for you is what is one, how can you tell? Because a lot of times people who are perfectionists don't think they're perfectionists, right? So that's like challenge number
Yeah,
one.
absolutely.
So, what is a sign that you should be looking for in yourself to figure out if you're a perfectionist? That's question 1. Question 2 is then what can you do about it, right?
Mhm. I think, there's this really commonly used phrase is like, is something good enough?
Mhm.
And a lot of times the answer for people is no. And I think that imperfectionism is sort of evaluating and asking this question of like, is anything ever good enough? Like,
Mhm.
you could have the best experience, maybe at a restaurant, and then ultimately you're just like, yeah, but the napkins, they just weren't folded the way that I like. And so I know that I'm sort of making light of it, but it's this idea of like, do you really have this awareness or even feedback from other people that it's difficult for you to appreciate the full picture? It's difficult for you to enjoy something, take credit, give credit. And ultimately, what I like to put forth is this idea of like, most people don't want to hear the phrase "I'm lowering my standards," and so I think it's better to say, "Can you revise your standard to ask like what's good enough? Does it need to be 99%? Like what is my passing grade?" And I know that that may not be a C, like it isn't even for me,
Mhm.
but ultimately I sort of set these different standards that say like if these two things go well, then this will be good enough.
That is powerful. What's good enough? Oh man, we could like stop right there. That is actually a really good tip. And so I guess the
Mhm.
next question I would ask you, kind of still along those lines, is if you work for someone who's a perfectionist,
Mhm.
kind of give some guidance to those of us that have had to be the have done that before, or people who are dealing with it now. What are the things that they can do to almost make their life a little bit easier, but still, to your point, have clear understanding from their perfectionistic boss when is good enough enough, right?
Yeah, I think it's almost being sure to establish a certain clarity around, like, remember I made that phrase of like unrelenting high standards. And so it's one of those things where something goes well and maybe they're quick to criticize, but you may put forth like almost like an additive statement, like, and I think the team, here's what I'd like to highlight that the team did or what I did. Just making room for that, but also getting things kind of clearly I want to say in writing in ways, like in an email, maybe say like, per our discussion. And this is not like the typical petty office per our discussion,
Mhm.
but more of like, I just want to summarize. This is sort of what you expect this way. It may even keep them grounded in what their expectations are and allow you to have a reference point to say, well, I thought, the goal was to accomplish this, not the other five things that have materialized since we last talked.
Well, it's really funny. You said that in a very polite way. CYA, people, CYA. Cover your tracks. Write it down.
Yeah.
Make sure, like, this is what I heard. Is this what you meant? Right. But that's
Mm-hmm.
good. That's really
Mm-hmm.
good because I know in the workplace that is a real struggle and people don't talk about it. So I'm glad that we're going there, and more importantly, that you specialize in it because it is a big issue. And so thank you for saying that. Now, I do want to go back to anxiety. I didn't forget because I know that that's also a big issue in the workplace, right? So, just
Mm-hmm.
like you did with or perfectionism, what would be some tips for people who may think that they're struggling with it? Like, what are some, like, if you should challenge yourself with this, and then that way you're having maybe an anxious moment, or you're dealing with anxiety or whatever. So what are some things that they can kind of spot check themselves as well?
Yeah, I think the anxiety tends to exist in two areas, primarily like physical or mental. And so I tell people maybe check in mentally if you're noticing these cycles of persistent worry, that even with a little bit of checking in or reassurance, they don't go away easily. And I know I like to give examples because we all have worries. I think about things like my schedule, my family, deadlines. But if you find yourself really like, I almost feel like the washing machine, right? Like this loop that's very difficult to break away from or get out of in a way that is impacting your concentration or your productivity. That's something to really check in about. Also, if you're noticing things like significant sleeplessness, I noticed that our sleep is actually usually one of the first things impacted by anxiety, difficulties with eating, and the symptoms really can vary. I also, when I think of physical things, there's like persistent migraines and headaches, overwhelming physical fatigue and dread, typically around going to work or when things are nearing, really important deadlines. And so, the goal isn't that you have to a- totally diagnose yourself, but ultimately, if you notice that your functioning is being impacted, it may be worth, speaking to even your primary care provider or
Mm.
starting to shop around for some resources.
Okay, good stuff. So now, Sarah, let's get you in this conversation as well, girl. So let's kind of shift gears for a second. And Sarah, the question I have for you is, when someone says that, when they use the word neurodiverse, what does that actually mean? Like who falls under the category of neurodiverse?
So for me, on a just broader term,
Hmm.
it's just a different style of learning, thinking, and processing is
Okay.
really what it comes down to me, which may lead to different reactions. Or if you think of like what is a standard, or like culturally norm, or what is the behavior standard. So a reaction or response to things. So the behaviors might be a little bit different just because of those different styles of learning and thinking and processing. So it doesn't mean that there needs to be a fix, right, or a cure, but there may need to be some like an understanding. So kind of the conversation of being able to talk to your employee or employer, that understanding, and there might need to be some different accommodations. So I like what Dr. Alicia was also talking about with anxiety or perfectionism, because that falls onto that neurodiversity with anxiety. Also, it's not just what you're doing for yourself, but also how can you change the environment. So for me, if I was a boss of, okay, I know Dr. Alicia struggles with anxiety or perfectionism, what can I also do to help change the environment a little bit to make it easier for her? Or if I know some of her coping mechanisms, how can I help accommodate the environment? Maybe it's something as simple as I send the agenda to her a little bit ahead of time so she has time to process the agenda a little bit more ahead of time than right in the moment if there is something big coming up.
So I really like what you said there, and I actually want to unpack that just a little bit. So do you feel like, and maybe this is kind of a generic or broad question, but do you feel like someone who is neurodiverse, that they should share that information with people in the
The
workplace
answer
specifically, or their boss, or?
is
Mhm.
yeah, so the answer is yes. And there has to be a safe environment set up for people to share that, right? I think just me, I am more of like, if you want to say maybe some trust issues, I'm not just going to divulge personal information to you day one. And there are some people that will, right? So I really think it's how did you set up the environment as a leader, as the company, as, a peer, because maybe I might give that information to a trusted peer who is helping me through that and not my boss. So I do think it is more helpful to divulge that information because then my environment right now, like I'm in this environment for 8 hours a day. How can I get my environment to help me regulate or help me process or whatever it is that my need is? And do I feel safe enough telling the people in my environment, are they actually going to help me through it? I do think, unfortunately, there has been a lot of history with reinforcement where environments will say, yes, we're inclusive, please tell us, and we want you to share, and then you divulge information and almost the opposite happens, right? You get ostracized, or people aren't helping you, or it's almost a sign of weakness is what it becomes. Like, oh, you're weak, you need to fix this. And it just becomes the opposite of what an inclusive environment is really meant to set up.
Yeah, and I think, and you two tell me, but I feel like it's because the information, or at least the acknowledgement, is out there now that it's still a slow moving process, but corporate America is at least trying to take steps to like, okay, this is part of the new workforce, and so what can I do? Because I think the word that you said, as far as is the environment set up to be safe, that's a fair question for all leaders to really be thinking about. Because I'll tell everybody a story that happened to me. So I was brought in to take over this team that wasn't functioning correctly. They weren't hitting their numbers, so on and so forth. And so I, move my family, come down, take over this low performing team. And there on the team, in kind of more of a sales support role, there was someone who was bipolar. Now, because the organization was really, really big, I had seen her before and met her before because I was in a different division. But, everything seemed, fine. Nothing stood out about her to me other than the fact that she was a great person, did a great job. However, when she worked on my team and now all of a sudden I was interacting with her every single day, what I quickly learned the hard way is that she was bipolar. And so when she was on her meds, things were great. When she was not, it was unbelievable, just the environment that was created. And I remember her and I having a situation, and she was enraged. And I don't think I've ever seen anybody that mad before, like ever, right? Whether it's in the workplace or not in the workplace. I mean, just absolutely enraged. And because I didn't know that she was bipolar, I had no idea. And all of a sudden I'm in this situation where she and I are in my office and she's literally losing it. And I didn't feel very safe. And so at this point, I'm thinking of all kind of different exit strategies, and like, me and this girl's getting ready to go to blows, right? Because over something so silly and stupid. But the reason why I tell that story is there was a big part of me, full transparency, that was pretty pissed that no one had told me in advance that, I had a person that was bipolar, and when things are good, and when things are not, things are not. And so I really felt like HR should have said something or stepped in, or somebody should have said something. This wasn't the way that I should have found out that I had someone that really had a particular situation that, had I known, I probably would have thought more about how, I could have prepared, right? So I guess the question I have for either one of you really is, where do you feel like HR, what's the role they play in this whole process? And is there a role? I know we've got HIPAA rules and all this other stuff. And so, kind of walk us through that, because to this day, that incident still bothers me. And maybe I'm looking at it incorrectly, and you're certainly welcome to correct me because you two are the trained professionals. But I just remember, as a leader in corporate, having to deal with something I did not anticipate it was like real time, having to deal with it with someone who, like literally, it wasn't like she was just mad. She was literally enraged. And so anyways, talk me through that, because I'm sure I'm not the only one in corporate that's ever dealt with it.
Wow. I mean, that sounds like a very significant experience. Even when, as you retell it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine what that must have been like. I think that the difficult part there is part of what you mentioned, there's layers. And so,
Mhm.
right, as a medical condition, that is your private information that, as you know, wouldn't be freely disclosed, by potentially HR. However, given that level of behavioral disturbance, I think it's something that one would hope is shared, or given accommodations to, but it just reminds me that we have so little, I think, work-related policy around behavioral disturbance, whereas we probably have policies around other types of maybe breakdowns or issues. And so I thought about the idea of, right, like mental health as physical health. If a person was at work throwing up frequently
Mhm.
every day, like there would be some sort of intervention. People would maybe tell them to seek support. Whereas this, it is more taboo and difficult to understand how to deal with. So, as a leader, I'm sure that was difficult, and there's very probably minimal pre-information that can be given, but it also kind of speaks to this idea of like mental health hygiene, and even mental health first aid, and understanding like how do we equip leaders and coworkers to recognize and understand certain warning signs, if anything else.
Yeah.
Cool. Sarah, what's
Uh,
your thoughts?
Along those lines, I don't, and I know it was a difficult situation, and we all have our feels in difficult situations. I don't think it was an HR issue
Hmm.
at that point in time because, like Dr. Alicia said, there are just certain things that aren't able to be disclosed, no matter how bad things got. To me, it screams systems issues, right? What systems did your company and your team have in place? Like Dr. Alicia said, with a lot of us mental health clinicians or even at schools, we get some sort of training before the year starts or throughout the school year at the end of the year on mental health first aid, how to notice triggers, how, to respond to triggers, how to set up some sort of plan, right? Behavior plans, even if they're not individual behavior plans, but some sort of behavior crisis management, behavior management plans if X happens. Now, granted, X may happen, you may implement the plan, you will have to debrief as a team and maybe update the plan or change the plan, but I really think it's a systems issue. I don't think enough companies in general, just regular companies, have any sort of systems around mental health supports and what that looks like, right? Kind of to the throwing up issue. We kind of know if someone throws up, all right, we need to get, the equipment and then dump the sand and, all the other things that we have. Someone needs to come and vacuum, or even, if someone gets something in their eye, there's the eye washing stations and, there's protocols around physical disturbances, but nothing around the mental health disturbances. Are there triggers that I could have seen, or during the conversation with this employee? Are there different ways I could have handled it, or things I should have said, or directions I could have gone in to maybe avoid the peak of that escalation? So I think it comes down to those systems. With systems do companies have in place to anticipate, and training do staff have to anticipate potential breakdowns like that?
Yeah, and I actually think that's a really good point because I can tell you in this particular company there was no system, right? And it went from 0 to 60 so quickly that I do agree with both of you that there definitely needs to be something. And so we've got, people who are listening to this that will be, they run companies and what have you. If all things were possible from your perspective, what would be one or two things that you think companies should do to create a mental health crisis support kind of plan, right? So that's the first question. And then while I'm on that same thought process, I think about how right now in the world that we live in, whether it's schools having a system that if there's a shooter, they hopefully have a lockdown system or what have you. I come from aviation, so a lot of times you have systems in place, you train for the worst case scenario. And, what's interesting, that same company, now that I'm thinking about it, we had a very strong system for if there was, a disgruntled employee or a active shooter or something like that. We had systems and processes for that. But you're right, there wasn't a process for someone that perhaps is having a mental breakdown, for lack of a better word. And so what would you say for companies, and in your opinion, if you can only do one or two things, here's what I'd suggest you do. And then kind of lay that on me, ladies.
One or two. That's so hard.
And the
To me,
reason, and I'll give you time to think about it, but the reason why I'm bringing
yeah.
it up is I'm actually, I hope this isn't going to be too controversial, but I'm looking at it from a business perspective, right? It is because, businesses, how do I want to say this? A lot of businesses talk a really good game right now, right? On the sense of, oh, we want you to bring your full self to work, right? Or, we want to be a place where everybody's welcome and everybody's included. And so all that is great, but there's the business side of, okay, well, how much money, time, energy, resources am I going to spend for a very small part of the population? Right. And so when you give me your answer about one or two things that companies should do, just kind of keep that in mind, because, if we're being intellectually honest, a company, if it's just a regular company, who's just trying to, get product X out the door, how much money do they have to spend on the, small percentage of people, if anybody, that may fall under, I'll use the extreme one, like the bipolar, right? I think anxiety is more, I think we all have anxiety somewhere along the line. But I'm being honest, like, companies think about, okay, I've got to spend money and resources for this, that, and the other, because what I'm hearing from you two is just having a, employee resource center or an emergency that they can call in if they're struggling may not be enough, right? Because that's not hitting the there and the company and the building and the room in the moment, right? As much as, oh, you can always go and call and ask for help, down the line, right? That doesn't always help in that particular real-time moment.
The two things that pop up for me, and I don't know in which order.
Uh-huh.
One is, especially for the leadership team, some sort of training, right? I think they need to invest in training for themselves and their leadership team. It may not be, I think eventually it'd be good for the whole, your whole entire team, but just for the leadership team to really understand, what is mental health, right? What is neurodiversity? What does that look like? How does that show up in people? Just because it's not just a one and done thing. It doesn't just look one way. To then be able to also recognize what could triggers look like in those moments. And then that response piece, like how to set up environments that hopefully will have less triggers, but then also when these triggers and those escalations do happen, how do we respond to it? Like you said, not just you're calling a person, but we have someone in building in the moment that is able to handle and manage that in the moment. So that would be my first thing is, if you want to get better at something, you got to learn it. You got to really immerse yourself and actually get to know it, and not just a one and done PD, but continuous learning, which then leads to some of my next part of that self-reflection, right? It's easy to go to a training and say, yep, I did this training and I did it, but actually to do some self-reflection. What does this look like at our company? What do our systems look right now? Getting feedback from staff. Because like we just said, you may not know if you have someone who is not neurodivergent on your team, right? Because they have not disclosed that yet. But getting feedback from people, it might help. Maybe it's something as small as having like and this, may seem childish, but we all do it, right? A calming area where you can play music, or dimming the lights a little bit somewhere in the area. having more sensory tools available, stress balls, things at work that makes it, everyone's just going to get one. So it's not like, well, you need one because of X, so what are little things on how you can change the environment that will actually better the whole environment? Because if everyone feels a little bit more relaxed, or they have an actual break, not a working break, but a break to really go outside and take a walk, or have a different area to go eat lunch, some of those different things. Do we have plants in the building? Just different little things on how to change the environment. But you won't know what to do if you just go off of a generic list. You actually have to do an honest self-reflection of your systems and get that input from your team.
I think that's really good. I think that, and Alicia, I'm going to ask you your thoughts as well. But what I really love about that, Sarah, is the fact that that's the same thing we would ask people to do, companies, leaders, et cetera, to do for any other group. Right. And so this particular group, in the sense of neurodiverse or neurodivergent groups, we don't spend a lot of time, energy, and effort really even having the conversation about it. But yet everything that you just said, as far as, doing some reflection, looking at, being honest as an organization, are we truly inclusive, welcoming, to all different groups? And so I think that we tend to do it like, yeah, we've got, women friendly programs, what I mean? Like, we do it for certain groups because it maybe it's easier, maybe it's less to think about, maybe it's not as compliance central, right? When you start thinking of health and mental health and HIPAA rules and all that stuff. So I think that that's a really, really good point to start with reflection as an organization, and then start to set up the environment so that you're right. The stress, it's not like you get a stress ball because I think you need it. It's like, no, we're all getting stress balls, and because we all need it, right? And so I love that. I love that. Alicia, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my ideas are very similar, very much similar to the concept of investing in the overall wellness of your team. And so even sort of, because I think it's also important to realize that while everyone may not be identified as neurodivergent, mental health diagnoses, illness, and symptoms don't discriminate against the timing and who will experience them. And so I think if you're promoting and spreading just general mental health education and things about overall wellness to the entire team, it gives people a reference point to identify maybe when they're off base or when they're in need of more support. And this also doesn't require people at work to be functioning and operating above their pay grade or their level in terms of, I need to now be expertly able to identify mental health symptoms or things like that. I also think in terms of like a policy level, like having those practices and protocols in place around, like, if someone seems to be experiencing a mental health emergency, here are the numbers we call, here's what we do as a team. Do we, here's who we contact, here's how we communicate, and here's how we follow up. And this way, it also normalizes this idea that, like, this is something that could happen, but we feel confident and reassured in how we would deal with it, which I think promotes the idea of safety and belonging within the workplace. If there's policy and thoughtfulness and protocol around something, then we at least know that it exists. Not that there's room for it, but I think ultimately, like we talked about before, if we have a policy for eye contamination, then we ought to have a policy for someone maybe having some difficult thoughts. And I also want to make the point that, like, the expression of mental illness at work isn't always in the form of violence. And so I think oftentimes, I think we are, of course, invested in that, but it may not be the only presentation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know what? That's a really good point, because the stuff that you see on the news, right, is probably more the extreme. Like, oh, okay, this happened at XYZ company, and they had to go on lockdown or whatever. But you're right, that's more the extreme versus just the everyday type of situations. These like, I actually wrote down what you all were saying. Those tidbits are really, really helpful, and they also don't sound super expensive, right? I love it. I love that. Really good input. So now the question I have, and this is the final question I have for the two of you. So I would love to get the thought from both of you in regards to what's one thing that a leader can do to just really be better at being able to serve all of their employees, and specifically those that perhaps have mental wellness, mental health type of scenarios. So Sarah, what's your thoughts? One thing this week they can do.
Build rapport is what came to my mind instantly. Just getting to know each other. There is a level of, I don't know if the word is intimacy, but intimacy you can have with staff while also being their boss, right? Building that rapport, getting to know them, taking time to check in with them. How, like Dr. Alicia was saying with wellness, how are you feeling today? How are things going? Again, you don't need to share all the little tidbits about being in their business, and then remembering things, right? So if I check in this week and, oh, I'm really struggling because there's something going on at home, even if they don't divulge the full details, and the next week being like, how are things going? I remember you saying you were having a difficult time last week. How did that go? How can I support you this week to be able to do your job better, and not just have it being words, but then actually follow through with some of those things. Because I find when you get to know people, they start telling you what they need. And when you start listening, then you're actually able to take action. But that all starts off with building rapport. People aren't going to tell you anything if they don't trust you or have some sort of connection with you.
I love that. And I would agree with that as well. So Dr. Alicia, what are your thoughts? Do you have anything that you would add to that?
Something different that I would say is maybe like reframing rest as a strategy. And so starting with yourself and telling yourself like rest won't be conditional. Like I won't say I'm gonna rest when I get all of this done, but thinking about it as like this marathon drive or run in which you're kind of planning, pacing, thinking about when am I going to slow down, speed up, and stop. And I think if you do that for yourself and also encourage and model it to others, you'll start to see people making room for themselves in a way that doesn't reduce productivity, but actually like restores their capacity.
I love it. I love it. This was so, so, so good. And so we're going to make sure that we include links. So if you want to have a discussion or get a little bit further in discussion with Sarah and Alicia, we'll have links and all that good stuff that you can just click. Because one of the things I would encourage all leaders, but especially those who are running companies, listen, we are living in such a place that, if we want to be able to hire the best, then that's going to mean that we're going to be working with people who are not like us. They may see the world differently than we do. Culturally, they may be different than us. They may have different abilities, that they may, move about the world differently than we do. Or, of course, then there's just the generational differences, the gender differences, the race differences, there's differences. But the statistics are clear that the more different and diverse your team is, the results are really, really clear. Google it. Don't trust me. Harvard's done reports. McKinsey's done reports. Deloitte has done reports. There's enough information out there to show that the more diverse your team is, the better your results will be, right? It's not about DEI. It's about ROI. And so I love the conversation that we had today because we zoned in on a particular segment when we think of differences. And so what I would really encourage you is, if you run a business or you own a business or you have influence in a business, the tidbits that Sarah and Dr. Alicia both mentioned, as far as like, and I'm going to read some of these off based on my notes, just to have a environment, right? To set up an environment. So whether it's a calming area or sensory tools that can be on everybody's desk, or overall wellness, checking in with your team, building their rapport. And then of course, having the discussion about here's what we do as a team. And then also making sure that we do change this horrible thought process, which is, oh, I'll rest when I'm dead. Let's get rid of that, because that is not effective for corporate America. But to reframe rest, I love that. And then of course, just to build a rapport. When we think about from my end, ally leadership and everything that our brand represents. Ally is an acronym. It stands for ask, listen, learn, and then you take action. So if you want to be a leader that's being effective in leading today's modern workforce, you've got to be an ally. And ally, again, you've got to know how to ask, you've got to know how to listen, learn, and then you take action based on all that information that you've received about your employees. And so this was amazing, ladies. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I am so grateful. And this was a very good, thought-provoking conversation. And what I love about it is that we've got immediate things that we can do as leaders or business owners to make sure that our environments are different based on the information that you two shared. So thank you so very much, ladies. Round of applause for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. And again, we'll have all the links in there for you to be able to get in touch with these two wonderful ladies and have them come in your business and share the thoughts of little things that you can do to make your business more inclusive. Thank you so much for tuning in to Not Like Me. Listen, if this conversation made you think, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with a colleague or send it to a friend or a loved one. Bring someone else into the conversation, because growth doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we learn from others, even when they're not like you. I'm Stephanie Chung, and I look forward to seeing you next time.